The year 1873 was a canvas of dust and decay in the desolate expanse of the American West. Haven Creek, a town clinging to the banks of a tired river, was no exception. Its main street was a permanent scar of dried mud and grit, lined by ramshackle buildings that sagged under the weight of time and neglect. The air tasted of dust and despair, a familiar cocktail to Sheriff Elias Thorne. He was a man made of grit and shadow, his face a roadmap of hard-lived years, a constant scowl etched above a thick graying mustache. His past was a heavy cloak he wore every day, a silent testament to a lawman's life that had seen too much. His morning began, as it always did, with the low sun casting long shadows across the empty street. But this morning was different. A boy, no older than 10, his face a canvas of terror, burst into the sheriff's office, gasping for air. "Sheriff Thorne." "It's the Keene boys. They're gone." Thorne's heart, a weathered drum, skipped a beat. Billy and Arthur Keene, ages 12 and 9, were a constant source of mischief and concern. Orphaned a year prior, they were now under the reluctant care of their aunt, a woman who treated them more like a burden than kin. Their fascination with the town's cemetery was a morbid obsession that most adults chose to ignore. They spent hours there, whispering to headstones and mapping out the silent residents. The townspeople often dismissed them as odd, but Thorne saw a deeper, more troubling loneliness in their actions. He grabbed his hat and gun belt, the leather creaking with a familiar protest. The cemetery was on a small rise to the west of town, a field of tilted stones and sun-bleached crosses. As he rode toward it, the lowing of cattle and the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer faded into a chilling silence. The sun was still low, casting a sickly yellow light on the graves. He saw the aunt, her face a mask of weary exasperation, wringing her hands by the cemetery gates. "They're not here, Sheriff," she said, her voice a reedy whisper. "I told them not to, but they were here last night, sleeping on the graves. Found them myself before dawn, said they were having a sleepover with the silent ones." She shuddered. "I told them to come home for breakfast, and when I went back out, they were just gone." Thorne dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel path. He walked toward the center of the cemetery, his eyes scanning the familiar markers. He knew the boy's favorite spot, the grave of a man named Silas Thorne, a distant relative of his own who died in an accident years ago. It was a simple stone, half buried in the tall grass. And there, beside it, was a sight that sent a cold spike of dread through him. A small, neat pile of belongings. 2 worn blankets folded with an eerie precision. 2 tin canteens, their leather straps coiled neatly. And 2 small carved wooden figures, a horse and a rabbit, placed side by side. It was all so orderly, so final. There were no tracks leading away, no signs of a struggle. Just the pristine evidence of their last known location, as if they had simply evaporated. The town soon gathered, their faces a mix of fear and morbid curiosity. The silence of the cemetery was shattered by their hushed whispers. "It's that story," someone murmured, a voice laced with dread. "The band story." Thorne turned, his gaze sharp. He'd heard of it. A local legend about a man who vanished and was said to have walked with the dead. But it was just a tale, a way to scare children. Or so he thought. "What story?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. An old woman, her face a web of wrinkles, stepped forward. "They say it's not a ghost story, Sheriff. They say it's about a man who learned the secrets of the dead. Not magic, no. Something else. Something he learned from their silence." Thorne dismissed her, turning his attention back to the grave. He knelt, his gloved hand hovering over the blankets. The air was still, but he felt an unseen presence, a sense of deep wrongness. This wasn't a runaway. This was something else. A knot of unease tightened in his stomach. He wasn't just looking for 2 lost boys. He was looking for an answer to a question that nobody in Haven Creek dared to ask out loud. What happens when a legend becomes reality? He stood up, the weight of the town's fear settling on his shoulders. The cemetery, once a place of quiet reflection, now felt like a living, breathing entity, holding a secret it would not give up. The neatly folded blankets and the toy figures were not a sign of a child's game, but a deliberate message, a statement. As the sun climbed higher, casting away the early morning chill, Thorne knew his investigation had just begun. He looked at the townspeople, their faces a blend of terror and suspicion. He had a feeling that the silence of the cemetery was nothing compared to the secrets they were all hiding. The Keene boys were gone, but their absence was a terrifying presence, a hole in the fabric of Haven Creek that was growing larger by the second. And he had a sinking feeling he wouldn't like what he found at the bottom of it. The real terror wasn't in the supernatural, but in the chilling coldness of a deliberate act. Thank you for watching the first chapter of the macabre case of the Keene boys who slept on graves and vanished. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to our channel to make sure you don't miss the next part of this chilling mystery. The Haven Creek Saloon, a place where the day's toil was washed away with whiskey and weary conversation, became the epicenter of speculation. Thorne sat in a dark corner, a glass of lukewarm water untouched before him, his eyes scanning the room. The usual boisterous laughter was muted, replaced by a low hum of hushed whispers. The disappearance of the Keene boys had cast a long shadow over the town's weary facade. Every face he saw was a potential suspect, a repository of secrets waiting to be unearthed. The saloon's owner, a burly man named Jebediah, approached with a concerned frown. "Elias, any word on the boys?" Thorne shook his head, the movement a slow, weary pendulum. "Nothing. No tracks, no sign of a struggle. It's like they just dissolved." Jebediah's frown deepened. "People are talking about that story, the one they say is banned. About Thomas O'Malley." Thorne's gaze sharpened. "O'Malley? The man who was buried alive by mistake?" "The very same," Jebediah said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "They say he clawed his way out, but when he came back he wasn't right. Not crazy, not insane, just empty. They say he learned something from the silence of the earth, something that made him dangerous, and they say he took children with him, to teach them." "That's a fairy tale, Jeb," Thorne said, though a cold dread snaked its way up his spine. The story of Thomas O'Malley was a local legend, a tale whispered around campfires. It was a story the town elders had actively suppressed, calling it morbid and ungodly. The fact that the boys had been sleeping on graves and had vanished gave the legend a chilling new weight. A group of cattle ranchers at a nearby table were talking, their voices low and coarse. Thorne leaned closer, his senses on high alert. "Crazy kids," one of them said. "Always messing around that cemetery. Should have seen it coming. Heard they were talking to the dead," another added, a sneer on his face. "Crazy like their mother was. Used to say she could hear things in the wind." Thorne stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor, silencing the men. "Their mother was a good woman," he said, his voice hard. The men recoiled, their faces flushing. Thorne's reputation was built on fairness, but also on a temper that could flare like a wildfire. He walked out of the saloon, the cool night air a welcome change from the smoke-filled room. He mounted his horse and rode back to the cemetery, the moonlight painting the headstones in a ghostly white. He dismounted and walked to the Keene boys' grave, kneeling in the soft, dark soil. He ran his fingers over the meticulously folded blankets, a chilling thought forming in his mind. This wasn't a sudden, unplanned act. It was deliberate. The boys had been prepared. He stood up and walked to the grave of Silas Thorne. He traced the faded letters on the stone, his mind racing. Was there a connection? Was this just a coincidence? Or was there a deeper, more sinister pattern? He felt a sense of disquiet, as if he was being watched. He turned, his hand instinctively going to his gun. But there was no one, just the silent sentinels of the dead. Thorne returned to his office, the stillness of the night weighing on him. He lit a kerosene lamp, its flickering light casting dancing shadows on the walls. He pulled out a dusty journal from a locked drawer, its pages yellowed with age. It was his father's journal, a record of the early days of Haven Creek. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning for any mention of Thomas O'Malley, of strange disappearances, of anything that could shed light on the boy's vanishing. He found an entry dated 1855. It detailed a series of strange events. Livestock found dead with no visible wounds, whispers of a man who could speak with the silence of the earth, and finally, the disappearance of a young woman's child. The entry ended abruptly, with a single chilling sentence. The true horror is not what they see, but what they feel, and what they are taught to do. A new wave of unease washed over Thorne. This wasn't a ghost story. It was a psychological one, a story about manipulation, about a person who could prey on the vulnerable, who could teach them to disconnect from the world of the living. He thought of the Keene boys, of their loneliness, their obsession with the dead. They were perfect targets. He closed the journal, the weight of the knowledge a heavy burden. The disappearance of the Keene boys was not a random act. It was a calculated one, a dark narrative playing out in the dust and shadows of Haven Creek. The real question was not where they were, but who had taken them and why. The search was no longer for two lost boys, but for a man who could turn loneliness into a weapon and who had just found two more perfect students. The following morning, Haven Creek awoke to a somber, oppressive silence. The usual sounds of a working town were muted, the rhythm of life disrupted by the gaping hole left by the vanished boys. Sheriff Thorne found himself in the humble cabin of the Keene boys' aunt, a woman named Martha, whose initial exasperation had given way to a quiet, profound grief. She sat at a worn wooden table, a half-eaten bowl of porridge before her, her hands trembling. "They were just so lonely, Sheriff," she said, her voice a fragile whisper. "Ever since their mother, well, since she passed, they clung to each other, and to that cemetery. It was their place of peace, I think." Thorne nodded, his gaze compassionate. "Tell me about their mother, Martha. What was she like?" Martha's eyes welled with tears. "Ilara. She was a kind soul, but she was always a little strange. She loved old stories, the kind of stories nobody else paid attention to. She used to talk about the whispers in the ground, the things that the silent earth could tell you." Thorne leaned forward. "What kind of whispers?" "Not voices, no," Martha said, wiping a tear from her cheek. "She said it was a feeling, a sense of peace, a way to shut out the world. She'd go to the cemetery and just sit for hours. She said it was the only place she felt understood." A chilling realization settled in Thorne's gut. The mother's seemingly harmless fascination with the cemetery wasn't just a quirk. It was a deep-seated psychological need, one she had passed on to her children. The boys' obsession was not a morbid game, but an echo of their mother's emotional state. They weren't looking for ghosts. They were seeking the same comfort she had found. Thorne thanked Martha and left the cabin, his mind racing. He rode to the cemetery again, the midday sun beating down on him. This time he didn't just look at the boys' belongings. He looked at the surrounding graves, the names, the dates. He was looking for a pattern, a connection he had missed. He found nothing. No shared surnames, no common dates of death. The only link was the Keene boys themselves. He then rode to the town's small library, a single room attached to the church. The librarian, an elderly man with a perpetually nervous twitch, eyed Thorne with suspicion. Thorne knew the librarian had been one of the town elders who had suppressed the O'Malley story. "I need to see the town records," Thorne said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Specifically the records from 1855 and the O'Malley burial records." The librarian's face paled. He reluctantly led Thorne to a dusty back room, pulling a heavy ledger from a high shelf. Thorne's fingers brushed the leather cover, a sense of history and dread permeating the air. He opened the ledger, the pages brittle and yellowed. He found the entry for Thomas O'Malley's burial. It was a simple entry. Died of a fever, buried on July 14th, 1855. But there was a small, almost invisible note in the margin, written in a different hand. "Exhumed 2 days later, coffin found empty, no explanation. Thorne's blood ran cold. The legend wasn't a legend. O'Malley hadn't just been buried alive. He had been exhumed, and his body was gone. But if the body was gone, why was the story of his escape so prevalent? Thorne flipped through the following pages, searching for more. He found nothing. He looked at the librarian, whose eyes were fixed on the ledger with a mixture of fear and shame. "What happened to him?" Thorne demanded. "The story says he clawed his way out, but the records say his coffin was empty." The librarian swallowed hard. The family, they were powerful. They didn't want the truth to get out. They buried him again in a secret plot, said he had risen, but it wasn't a miracle. They feared it was something unholy. Thorne's mind reeled. If the family had covered up the truth, what was the real story? And what did it have to do with the Keene boys? He left the library, the ledger's weight still a presence in his mind. The town wasn't just hiding a ghost story. It was hiding a human drama, a deliberate act of deception. He had to find out why. He rode to the O'Malley family estate, a sprawling ranch on the outskirts of town. He found the current patriarch, a stern-faced man named Samuel O'Malley, sitting on his porch, a shotgun resting across his lap. Samuel's face was a mask of cold suspicion. "Heard you were asking questions, Sheriff," Samuel said, his voice a low growl. "About my grandfather. That's a story best left alone." "2 boys are missing, Samuel," Thorne said, his voice firm. "And their last known location is tied to that story. I need to know the truth." Samuel's eyes were cold as stone. "The truth is a dangerous thing, Sheriff. Some things are best left buried." Thorne's blood ran cold. The man's words were a threat, a confirmation of the town's conspiracy of silence. The horror wasn't supernatural. It was psychological. The O'Malley family wasn't just hiding a burial. They were hiding a secret, a dark truth that had a direct connection to the missing boys. Thorne knew he was on the right track, but he also knew that pursuing it could be his last act. The real terror wasn't in the disappearance of 2 boys, but in the depths of human cruelty and the lengths people would go to protect a dark secret. The sun beat down on Haven Creek with an unforgiving intensity, mirroring the heat of Thorne's frustration. He had hit a wall. The townspeople were tight-lipped, their fear of Samuel O'Malley and the unspoken history of the town far outweighing their concern for the missing boys. Thorne knew he couldn't rely on the community for help. He had to find a different path, a different source of information. He thought back to the night of the disappearance. He had been so focused on the lack of evidence at the scene that he hadn't considered the possibility of a witness who might be too terrified to come forward. He recalled the boy who had first reported the disappearance, a young orphan named Jeremiah, who lived on the outskirts of town in a dilapidated shack near the train tracks. Thorne rode his horse to the shack, the rhythmic clatter of the train tracks a constant presence in the distance. The shack was little more than a pile of weathered wood and tin, and Jeremiah, a thin boy with wide, haunted eyes, was sitting on the steps, whittling a small piece of wood. "Jeremiah," Thorne said softly, dismounting, "I need to talk to you about the Keene boys." Jeremiah's eyes widened in fear, and he clutched the piece of wood tightly. "I don't know anything, Sheriff. I just saw they were gone." Thorne knelt, his voice gentle. "I know you're scared, son. But 2 boys are missing, and I think you know more than you're letting on. Tell me what you saw that morning. Everything." Jeremiah hesitated, his gaze darting nervously to the surrounding trees. I was out early, looking for kindling, and I saw them. The Keene boys. They were walking away from the cemetery." "Walking with who?" Thorne asked, his heart pounding. Jeremiah shook his head. "Alone. They were walking together, but there was a man. He wasn't walking with them, not exactly. He was just standing there, by the road, watching them, and he was smiling. Not a happy smile, a cold one." "Can you describe him?" Thorne asked, his voice low. Jeremiah bit his lip. his brow furrowed in concentration. He was tall, and he had a beard, and his eyes, they were dark, like holes in his face. He shivered, and he was wearing a very nice suit, not like a man from this town. A man in a suit in the dusty West was a rare sight, a sign of wealth and status. Thorne's mind immediately went to Samuel O'Malley, but Jeremiah's description didn't match the stern, unsmiling rancher. This was someone else. Someone with a connection to the O'Malley family, perhaps, but not a rancher. A businessman? A lawyer? "What did you do?" Thorne pressed. "Nothing," Jeremiah whispered. "I was scared. I hid. And then I heard a sound, like a shovel scraping, and a laugh, a quiet laugh. And then nothing." Thorne stood up, his mind a storm of thoughts. A man in a suit, a quiet laugh, a shovel scraping. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, but they were forming a terrifying picture. This wasn't just a simple disappearance. This was a sophisticated, deliberate act. The meticulously folded blankets, the neat pile of belongings, they were all part of a larger, horrifying ritual. He rode back to Haven Creek, his mind working furiously. He went to the town's telegraph office, a small shack next to the train station, and sent a wire to a contact in the state capital, a fellow lawman he trusted. He requested a background check on the O'Malley family, specifically any relatives, associates, or business partners who had visited Haven Creek in the last few weeks. While he waited for the response, Thorne returned to the library. He knew he had to dig deeper into the O'Malley family's history beyond the official records. He found a ledger from the 1850s, a record of every transaction in the town. He searched for O'Malley's name and found a series of large payments to a doctor from out of town, a man named Dr. Alistair Finch. The payments were made in the weeks following the burial of Thomas O'Malley. Thorne's heart pounded. A doctor. It made a chilling sort of sense. The story of a man who clawed his way out could easily be a cover-up for something far more sinister. A body that had been exhumed and preserved for some unknown purpose. The body wasn't a spirit. It was a physical object of study. And O'Malley wasn't crazy. He was a subject. The telegraph wire from the state capital arrived later that day. Thorne's hands trembled as he read it. The message confirmed his worst fears. Samuel O'Malley had a brother, a doctor named Arthur O'Malley, who had moved east years ago to study medicine. Arthur had returned to Haven Creek a few months prior, claiming he was there to visit family. His description matched Jeremiah's, tall, bearded, with dark, unsettling eyes. And he was a man who preferred to wear fine suits. Thorne's world was a storm of revelation. The mystery wasn't about a ghost. It was about a man who had dedicated his life to a macabre experiment. A man who had used his own family's tragedy to delve into the forbidden secrets of the dead. He had found a way to teach people to disconnect from their emotions, to find solace in the stillness of the earth, a state that was a step away from death itself. The Keene boys, emotionally vulnerable and seeking solace in the cemetery, were the perfect candidates. The whispers in the ground weren't spiritual. They were psychological. Arthur O'Malley was the monster, and he was still in town. The setting sun painted the sky in streaks of bruised purple and fiery orange. But the beauty of the evening was lost on Thorne. The knowledge that a methodical, psychological predator was loose in Haven Creek, possibly still watching, was a chilling weight on his shoulders. Arthur O'Malley was a man who moved in the shadows, a specter of the town's hidden history. Thorne had to find him, and he had to do it before the boys were lost forever. He knew he couldn't ride out to the O'Malley estate and demand answers. Samuel O'Malley would deny everything, and Arthur would likely be long gone. He needed evidence, a link, a piece of the puzzle that would not only expose Arthur, but also lead him to the boys. He went back to the town's small library, the ledger of O'Malley's transactions still a key to the mystery. He found a new detail, a chilling one. In the months before his death, Thomas O'Malley had a series of payments to a small, private clinic in a neighboring state, a clinic known for its unconventional and often dangerous medical practices. The clinic was run by a Dr. Alastair Finch, the same man the O'Malley family had paid after Thomas's burial. The plot thickened. Thomas O'Malley hadn't just been sick with a fever. He had been a patient who, perhaps, hadn't died at all. Thorne's mind raced. He had to be a subject of some sort of experiment, and the burial was part of the process. He went to the O'Malley estate, but this time he went to the back of the property, to the private cemetery where the O'Malley family was buried. He found a small, unmarked stone, barely visible under a tangle of weeds. It was not a burial site. It was a marker. He began to dig, the shovel's rhythmic scraping a jarring sound in the quiet of the evening. After an hour of hard labor, his shovel hit something solid. It wasn't a coffin. It was a sturdy wooden box, small and bound with thick ropes. Inside he found a meticulously kept journal. The journal was Thomas O'Malley's. The handwriting was neat, a testament to a man of education, but the contents were a descent into madness. The early entries detailed his struggle with a debilitating nervous condition, a condition that left him unable to feel emotions, to connect with the world. The later entries, however, were a terrifying revelation. He wrote about a doctor, Dr. Alastair Finch, who had offered a cure, a radical therapy involving sensory deprivation and a psychological reprogramming. The treatment, Thomas wrote, was meant to sever the connection to the emotional world, to find peace in a state of utter detachment. The burial was the final step, to simulate death itself, to erase the last vestiges of human feeling. The exhumation was a lie. The family had dug him up because the experiment had worked. Thomas O'Malley hadn't died. He had been transformed into an empty vessel, a man without emotions, a living ghost. Thorne read on, his hands trembling. The final entry was a chilling testament to the success of the experiment. Thomas wrote about a new sense of peace, a feeling of nothingness that was pure and absolute. He wrote about a desire to share this gift with others, to bring them to a place of perfect stillness. The journal ended with a single line: "The earth's silence is the truest solace. I will bring others to it." Thorne's blood ran cold. The Keene boys hadn't been taken by a ghost. They had been taken by a man who had become an emotionless automaton, a man who saw their loneliness and grief not as a problem, but as an opportunity. A man who was now teaching them the same horrifying cure. He closed the journal, the weight of the paper a new burden. He rode back to town, the journal clutched in his hand. He had to find Arthur O'Malley, and he had to do it now. He had a theory, a chilling one, about where the boys might be. Arthur, a man of science, would likely have a hidden laboratory, a place where he could continue his macabre work. And where would a man who had perfected the art of death choose to practice his craft? Thorne rode to the abandoned flour mill on the edge of town, a place locals avoided due to a series of unexplained accidents and strange noises. The mill was a cavern of shadows and decay, a perfect hideout. As he approached, he saw a flickering light in one of the upper windows. He dismounted, his heart pounding in his chest. He was close. The scent of dust and rot filled the air, a fitting aroma for a place of such dark secrets. He slipped inside, his gun drawn. The creak of his boots on the wooden floorboards was the only sound in the suffocating silence. He was alone, but he knew he was not alone. The living ghost of Thomas O'Malley was with him, and he was about to face the true human horror of Haven Creek. The abandoned flour mill was a colossal skeleton of wood and machinery, a silent testament to a bygone era. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of moonlight that sliced through a broken window, illuminating the treacherous path of rotting floorboards and rusted gears. Thorne moved with the quiet grace of a predator, his gun held steady, his senses on high alert. The air was thick with the scent of mold and decay, a grim perfume that set his teeth on edge. He followed the faint flicker of light, his boots thudding softly on the wooden floor. The sound of his own breathing seemed to echo in the vast, empty space. He climbed a narrow, winding staircase, the wood groaning under his weight, each step a potential betrayal. The light grew brighter, and he could hear a low hum, the sound of an unseen machine. He reached the top floor, a large open space where the mill's grinding gears and pulleys sat like ancient mechanical beasts. In the center of the room, a single kerosene lamp cast a flickering, jaundiced light on a makeshift laboratory. Tables were cluttered with glass jars, strange medical instruments, and stacks of papers filled with meticulous notes. And in the middle of it all, hunched over a workbench, was a man. He was tall, with a thick beard and eyes that were indeed like dark, empty holes. He was Arthur O'Malley. Thorne raised his gun. "Arthur O'Malley, stop what you're doing. Where are the boys?" Arthur looked up, his face a mask of serene calm. There was no fear in his eyes, no panic, only a profound, unnerving peace. He set down a small, intricate carving tool, its tip stained with a dark substance. "The boys are safe, Sheriff," Arthur said, his voice a low, melodic hum. "They are learning to find peace in the silence. The same peace my great-uncle Thomas found." He gestured to a small, enclosed space in the corner of the room, a soundproofed room with a single small window. Through the window, Thorne saw them. Billy and Arthur Keene lying on two makeshift cots, their eyes open and unblinking, their faces devoid of all expression. They were alive, but they weren't there. Their bodies were present, but their souls were gone. Thorne's blood ran cold. This wasn't a kidnapping, it was a psychological torture. Arthur hadn't physically harmed them, he had broken them. He had manipulated their loneliness, their grief, and their obsession with the cemetery to lead them into a state of emotional detachment. He had turned them into living dolls. "What have you done to them?" Thorne growled, his voice a guttural mix of rage and disgust. "I've given them a gift, Sheriff," Arthur said, his voice filled with a chilling paternal pride. "I've given them freedom from the pain of the world. The whispers of the ground are not supernatural, Sheriff. They are a physiological state, a state of absolute calm, a severing of the mind from the heart. My great-uncle Thomas wasn't crazy, he was a pioneer. He found a way to achieve this state. I've just refined his methods." Thorne took a step forward, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Let them go." Arthur shook his head, a look of pity on his face. "They are happy, Sheriff. Happier than they've ever been. You should try it. Imagine a world with no guilt, no fear, no regret. The guilt you carry, Sheriff, about your past, it could all be gone. You just have to let go." Arthur's words hit Thorne like a physical blow. The unspoken past, the weight he had carried for years, was now a weapon in this man's hands. He had done his research, not just on the boys, but on Thorne as well. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was a carefully planned psychological assault. "How did you do it?" Thorne demanded, his voice trembling with a fury he could barely contain. "I used their longing," Arthur said, a simple, factual statement. They were so lonely, so desperate to reconnect with their mother. I taught them that the true way to connect with the dead wasn't through ghosts, but through stillness, through becoming empty. I told them that the silence of the cemetery was the purest form of communication. They were so eager to believe me, so eager to feel something, or rather, nothing. Thorne looked at the boys again, their vacant eyes staring into an unseen abyss. He had to act, but he knew that a single wrong move could shatter whatever fragile hold they had on reality. He lowered his gun slightly, a gamble that might get him killed. "And you were teaching them this stillness?" Thorne asked, his voice calmer, a tactical move to draw Arthur out. "Yes," Arthur said, his face lighting up with a fanatical zeal. "It's a simple process. Sensory deprivation, repetitive motion, a steady stream of low-frequency sound, and a narrative. The story of Thomas. The story of a man who found a way to live without a soul, a man who found peace in the grave." Thorne saw the opportunity. And what happens if that process is interrupted? Arthur's calm facade broke for a split second, a flicker of genuine fear in his eyes. It would be catastrophic. The mind is a delicate thing. It would snap. They would be lost forever. Thorne took a step back, his mind working furiously. He had to stop Arthur, but he also had to save the boys. A loud crash from outside jolted them both. A group of townspeople, led by Jebediah and a few ranchers, had arrived, their faces grim, their hands clutching rifles and torches. They had followed Thorne's horse tracks. The mob's presence was a volatile, unpredictable force, a ticking bomb. Arthur's face hardened. He grabbed a small glass vial from the table, its contents a murky, dark liquid. "They will not be returned to a world of pain and suffering, Sheriff," he said, his voice now a low, menacing whisper. "I won't allow it." Thorne knew he had only one chance. He couldn't let Arthur administer whatever was in that vial. He had to stop him, but he also had to de-escalate the situation before the mob stormed the building and caused a tragedy. The human horror of Haven Creek was about to reach its terrifying climax. The flickering light of the mob's torches danced on the mill walls, casting grotesque, shifting shadows. The sound of their angry shouts was a new and terrifying presence in the suffocating silence of the building. Thorne was trapped between a madman and a mob, with the lives of two innocent boys hanging in the balance. "Arthur, don't do this," Thorne pleaded, his voice a low, urgent hiss. "There's another way." Arthur's hand holding the vial was shaking. The serene mask of calm had cracked, revealing a man terrified of losing control. "There is no other way, Sheriff. You don't understand. The world is a disease. The only cure is to disconnect, to become empty. I am giving them the only true freedom there is." The mob, having found the main entrance, began to push on the heavy wooden doors, the sound of splintering wood echoing through the mill. Thorne knew he had to act. He lunged forward, not at Arthur, but at the lamp on the workbench. He swept it off the table with a quick motion, plunging the room into total darkness. The mob's shouts from below turned into a confused chorus of yells. Thorne, with the advantage of knowing the layout of the mill, used the darkness as a weapon. He heard Arthur's frantic gasps, the sound of glass breaking as the vial hit the floor, the air filled with a bitter medicinal smell. Thorne stumbled forward, blindly reaching for Arthur. His hand found a shoulder, and he shoved hard. Arthur lost his balance, his body crashing into a stack of metal instruments. The sound of the fall was followed by a sickening thud. Thorne fumbled for a match, his hands trembling. The sound of the mob breaking through the doors filled the lower floor. He had to get to the boys. He found the soundproofed room and ripped open the heavy curtain, the moonlight streaming in through the small window. The boys were still there, their eyes wide and vacant. But their bodies were starting to tremble, a faint shivering that grew into a violent convulsion. The interruption of the process was having a catastrophic effect. He went to them, his hands shaking, and gently shook Billy. "Billy, it's me, Sheriff Thorne. You have to wake up. Come on, son. You have to fight this." Billy's eyes darted wildly, a glimmer of fear returning to their depths. He whimpered, a low, guttural sound. The emotional detachment was being violently undone, but it was being replaced by a terrifying, chaotic mental breakdown. Thorne knew he had to ground them, to pull them back into reality. He held up a small, carved wooden horse from the pile of belongings they had left behind. "Look, Billy, look at this. It's your horse. You remember making this, don't you? You carved it for your brother. You worked on it for days. You were so proud." Billy's vacant stare focused on the horse. A single tear, the first in what felt like an eternity, rolled down his cheek. My horse," he whispered, his voice a cracked and fragile thing. Thorne turned to the younger boy, Arthur. He held up the rabbit. "And this is your rabbit, Arthur. Billy made it for you. You have to wake up for him, son. He needs you." Arthur's eyes, too, found the wooden figure. A low sob escaped his lips. The silent, empty husks of the boys were slowly, agonizingly, returning to the world of the living. But the journey back was a painful one. The emotional and mental damage was immense, but they were alive. They were real. The mob stormed into the room, their torches illuminating the chaos. They saw Thorne, the two boys, and Arthur O'Malley lying in a broken heap on the floor, his head at a terrible angle. The mob's anger turned into a stunned, horrified silence. The madman was gone. The boys were found, but the sight of their traumatized state was a chilling victory. Thorne knelt beside the boys, shielding them from the harsh light and the judging eyes of the mob. He had found them, but he knew the road to recovery would be long and arduous. Arthur O'Malley had failed in his macabre mission, but he had succeeded in leaving a permanent scar on the boys' minds. The real horror of Haven Creek wasn't a ghost in the graveyard, but a human monster who had preyed on the emotional wounds of two lonely children. Thorne had won, but the cost was immense. The band story was no longer a legend. It was a terrifyingly real testament to the depths of human cruelty. Thank you for watching the 7th chapter of the macabre case of the Keene boys who slept on graves and vanished. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to our channel to make sure you don't miss the next part of this chilling mystery. The aftermath in Haven Creek was a tense, fragile thing. The townspeople were relieved the boys were found, but their relief was overshadowed by the chilling nature of their trauma. Billy and Arthur were returned to the reluctant care of their aunt, but their silence was a new and terrifying presence in the cabin. They didn't speak. They didn't eat. They just sat, their eyes staring into a middle distance only they could see. Thorne, now a hero in the eyes of the town, felt no such thing. He had stopped a monster, but he had failed to prevent the damage. He was plagued by a gnawing guilt. He should have listened sooner, should have acted faster. The boys were victims, and he, the lawman, had not been fast enough. He spent his days sitting with the boys, talking to them, reading to them, trying to coax them back to life. But their emotional disconnect was a thick, impenetrable wall. The doctors who were brought in from the capital were baffled. They called it a psychological fugue, a state of deep emotional shock. They had no cure, no medicine for the soul. Thorne, however, had the journal. Thomas O'Malley's journal. He spent hours poring over its pages, searching for a clue, a weakness in Arthur's method, anything that could help the boys. He read about the low-frequency sound, the repetitive motion, the narrative. He realized that the boys' silence wasn't a choice. It was a symptom of the process. Their minds had been trained to seek silence, to find solace in its emptiness. He had to find a way to break that pattern, to fill their minds with noise, with life. He began to bring them to the livery stable, a place full of life and sound. The clatter of horses' hooves, the clanking of metal, the shouts of the stable hands. The boys flinched at the noise, their hands flying to their ears, but Thorne didn't stop. He made them sit there for hours, enduring the assault of the world. It was a cruel form of therapy, but he had no other option. One day, while sitting in the stable, he saw a young stable hand, a boy named Caleb, trying to fix a broken saddle. The boy was struggling, his frustration growing with every failed attempt. Thorne saw a flash of an idea. He walked to the boy, took the needle and thread, and began to show him how to mend the leather. He didn't look at the Keene boys, didn't talk to them. He just worked, the rhythm of his hands a steady, calming presence. He felt a subtle shift. He glanced over and saw Billy and Arthur, their heads slightly tilted, their vacant eyes watching his hands. The motion, the steady rhythmic motion of mending the saddle, was a familiar sight. It was a human act, a purposeful act, a direct contrast to the aimless, repetitive motions Arthur had forced upon them. He continued to work, and then he began to hum, a low, tuneless melody. The boys flinched again, but they didn't turn away. The hum was an anchor, a sound of life, a sound of humanity. Thorne kept working, the hum a constant in the symphony of the stable. He felt a moment of hope, a fragile, trembling thing. He spent the next few days in the stable, doing small, repetitive tasks, mending tack, oiling leather, sharpening tools. He hummed constantly, a low, persistent sound. He saw the boys' eyes begin to follow him, their heads turning in unison. They were still empty, but they were no longer static. They were engaging with the world, even in a small way. One afternoon, a rancher came in, his face grim. "Sheriff, the O'Malley estate. It's been cleaned out. The family, they're gone." Left in the middle of the night. Thorne felt a cold surge of dread. The O'Malleys were running. They were burying the secret literally and figuratively. They were leaving Haven Creek to its own devices to deal with the aftermath of a secret they had nurtured for decades. He knew he couldn't pursue them. He had a duty to the town, a duty to the boys. He had to save them, to prove that human connection could triumph over human depravity. He returned to the cabin, the boys' faces still pale and blank. He sat down and picked up a piece of wood and his knife. He began to whittle, slowly, deliberately. The boy's eyes were fixed on his hands. He began to hum. After a few moments, he saw a tear, this time from Arthur, not a convulsion of fear, but a slow, quiet release of emotion. Arthur reached out a hand, his fingers trembling, and gently touched the wooden rabbit Thorne had placed beside him. He opened his mouth, and a single hoarse word escaped. Billy. Thorne's heart ached with a profound, soul-deep relief. The spell was broken, not with a sudden flash of light, but with a quiet, persistent act of human kindness. The boys were coming back. The horror was not in the dead, but in the living, in the monsters who would take away the very essence of what it meant to be human. But the solution to the horror was in the same place, in the quiet, persistent acts of love and care. The boys were a testament to that. They had returned from the land of the dead, not as ghosts, but as survivors. The return of the boys was not a sudden burst of joy, but a slow, gradual thawing. Their first words were hesitant, their first movements cautious. Their silence had been a comfort, a shield against the world, and now they had to learn to navigate its noise and its pain again. Thorne, now more of a father figure than a sheriff, dedicated himself to their recovery. He brought them to the river, teaching them to skip stones, the simple, repetitive act, a new form of therapy. He took them on walks through the fields, pointing out the wildflowers, the different birds, the mundane beauty of the world. He was rebuilding their connection to life, one small, insignificant detail at a time. The town, meanwhile, was grappling with its own ghosts. The flight of the O'Malley family, the gruesome nature of Arthur's experiments, and the chilling story of Thomas O'Malley were now a shared public secret. The townspeople, who had been quick to whisper and accuse, were now forced to confront their own complicity in the tragedy. They had ignored the warnings, dismissed the whispers, and chose silence over intervention. The banned story was now a permanent stain on the town's history, a testament to the dangers of burying the truth. Thorne was no longer just a sheriff, he was a moral compass. He began to hold meetings in the town hall, not to talk about crime but about the secrets they held, the stories they refused to tell. He spoke about the O'Malley family not as monsters, but as a product of the town's own fear and silence. He spoke about the need for honesty, for community, for a willingness to confront the darkness within themselves. Some townspeople resisted, clinging to their old ways, their old fears. But others listened. They began to talk, to share their own stories, to confess their own failings. The town was slowly, painfully, coming to terms with its own demons. The horror wasn't something that had happened to the Keene boys. It was something the entire town had allowed to happen. Thorne's own guilt, the weight of his past, was a part of this reckoning. He spoke about his own failings, about the lives he had lost, about the mistakes he had made. He showed the town that to heal, one must first be vulnerable, one must first admit their own complicity. The town's silence was a disease, and Thorne was trying to be the cure. One evening, as the sun set over Haven Creek, Thorne was sitting on the porch of the Keene cabin. Billy and Arthur, who were now talking and laughing, were playing with their wooden horse and rabbit. They were still fragile, still scarred, but they were alive. They were real. Billy came and sat beside Thorne, his small hand resting on the sheriff's arm. "We're not empty anymore, Sheriff," Billy said, his voice soft. "We feel things now." Thorne put his arm around the boy's shoulders. "That's a good thing, son. It's hard sometimes, but it's a good thing." He said the only way to be happy was to feel nothing, Arthur said, joining them. But it was a lie. We feel happy now, and it's better than feeling nothing. Thorne felt a profound sense of peace. The boys had found their way back. They had chosen to live, to feel, to embrace the messy, painful, beautiful reality of the world. The horror hadn't broken them. It had made them stronger. They were a testament to the power of human resilience, to the power of a single, persistent act of kindness. The town, too, was slowly changing. The cemetery, once a place of morbid fascination, was now a place of quiet reflection. People visited it not with fear, but with a sense of reverence for the lives that had been lived. The band story was no longer a ghost story. It was a cautionary tale, a lesson in the dangers of secrecy and the importance of empathy. Thorne knew his work in Haven Creek was far from over. He was no longer just a lawman. He was a caretaker, a shepherd of a fragile flock. He had come to Haven Creek to escape his past, but he had found something far more profound. A purpose. He had found a way to use his own pain to help others, to turn a tragedy into a catalyst for change. The darkness of the past was still there, a constant presence, but now there was a new light to guide the way. The years that followed in Haven Creek were not just a passage of time, but a testament to the town's profound, quiet transformation. The dust of the Old West still clung to the air, a constant reminder of its harsh realities, but the despair that once choked its streets had been replaced by a subtle, resilient sense of community and healing. The O'Malley estate, a sprawling ranch on the town's edge, remained a silent, haunted monument to a dark past. Its gates rusted shut, its windows like vacant, staring eyes. It was a place no one dared to enter, a grim landmark of the town's shared trauma. The Keene boys, now young men, were a living, breathing testament to the town's long, slow recovery. They had grown into resilient, thoughtful individuals, their childhood trauma not a source of shame, but a profound well of empathy and understanding. Thorne, now an older, grayer man, with a face weathered by time and sorrow, was no longer just the sheriff. He was the town's conscience, its living memory. He had turned his office into a gathering place, a sanctuary where people could come and talk, not just about their problems, but about their fears, their pasts, and the secrets they had held for so long. The oppressive silence that had once defined Haven Creek had been replaced by the quiet, constant hum of human connection, a sound far more comforting than any church bell. Billy and Arthur, having fully recovered from their ordeal, had decided to stay in Haven Creek, a choice that spoke volumes about their resilience. Billy became a carpenter. His hands, once used to carve small, insignificant toys, now used to build homes and furniture, to create things of purpose and permanence. His work was meticulous, a quiet rebellion against the chaos of his past. Arthur, with his quiet, introspective nature, became a teacher. He taught the children of the town not just to read and write, but to be kind, to be open, and to listen to each other. He taught them that the most important stories weren't the ones in books, but the ones they carried inside of them, stories of survival, of pain, and of hope. One day, while walking by the cemetery, a place that once held so much terror, Thorne saw Billy and Arthur standing by their mother's grave. They were not sad or morbid. They were talking to each other, laughing softly. Thorne knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that their connection to the cemetery was no longer one of grief or morbid fascination, but one of love and memory. The whispers of the ground for them were no longer a psychological terror, a sound that could sever them from the world, but a gentle, comforting memory of a mother they had loved and lost. The grave was no longer a symbol of nothingness, but a testament to a life that had been lived, and a connection that endured. The town, however, still held its secrets, its silent acknowledgments of a truth they could not fully erase. The O'Malley's escape had never been explained. They had simply vanished, leaving no trail. Thorne, despite his best efforts, had never found them. He knew, deep in his heart, that Arthur O'Malley was out there somewhere, a ghost of the past, a silent, empty automaton who had perfected the art of living without a soul. He was a constant, chilling reminder that the human capacity for cruelty and emotional depravity was limitless. The band story was not just a tale of the past. It was a living, breathing possibility, a threat that lingered just beyond the horizon. One evening, as Thorne was sitting on his porch, the sun setting in a blaze of red and gold, he saw a lone rider on the horizon. The rider was tall, with a thick beard, and he was dressed in a well-tailored suit that looked out of place in the dusty landscape. He rode past the town without a single glance, a specter of the past. Thorne felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He knew who it was. It was Arthur O'Malley. He had returned, not to cause chaos, not to seek revenge, but to see the aftermath of his work, to see that his cure, his ultimate experiment in human detachment, had failed, to see that the boys had chosen life, had chosen to feel, and in doing so, had defeated him. The sight of him was not a threat, but a confirmation. The true horror was not what he could do, but what he had already done, and what the boys had overcome. Arthur rode past the cemetery, past the town, and into the setting sun, a figure of profound loneliness and defeat. The real terror of the macabre case of the Keene boys was not in the dead, but in the living. It was not in a ghost story, but in the depths of human darkness. The O'Malleys, who had tried to bury the truth, had failed. The town, which had chosen silence, had learned its lesson. And Thorne, the weary lawman, had finally found his peace, not by outrunning his past, but by confronting it, and by using its pain to save two boys from a fate worse than death. The band story was no longer a secret, but a legacy. A chilling reminder that the greatest horror is not what we don't know, but what we refuse to see. The silence of the grave is a small comfort compared to the terrifying emptiness of a human heart. The last whisper of the story was not a scream of terror, but a quiet, chilling sigh of a life lived without a soul.